For new parents, David and Chloe Miller, silence wasn't golden, it was a mythical creature. Their world, shrunk to the four walls of a quiet suburban house, was ruled by the piercing cries of their newborn son, Leo. In their desperation, they brought home the Somnus 3000, a white noise machine promising a sanctuary of sound. But the piece it delivered was a Trojan horse. Within the machine's endless, algorithmically generated static, something was dormant. An ancient, sound-based intelligence that didn't make noise, but wove it. And it was about to tune their reality to its own terrifying frequency. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The silence in the Miller house was a fragile, temporary thing, a thin layer of ice over a deep, turbulent ocean of noise. For 3 weeks, that noise had a name, Leo. David Miller, an architect accustomed to the clean lines and predictable physics of his profession, found his world thrown into a maelstrom of unpredictable shrieks, sour milk, and the bone-deep ache of sleep deprivation. His wife, Chloe, seemed to be physically tethered to their son's distress. Her face a mask of exhaustion, her movements a slow, weary dance of rocking, shushing, and feeding. The house, once their proud first purchase, had become a pressure cooker of parental anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards was a potential cataclysm, every distant siren a threat to the precious fleeting moments of quiet. It was Chloe's sister who, during a tearful phone call, mentioned the Somnus 3000. "It saved us," she had said, her voice evangelical. "You just find the right sound, and it's like a switch flips." Desperation was a powerful motivator. That afternoon, David found himself at a brightly lit baby store, staring at a sleek white device that looked more like a high-end smart speaker than a simple sound machine. The box for the Somnus 3000 promised a symphony of tranquility with its complex, algorithmically generated soundscapes. He read the names aloud under his breath. Calm rain, ocean waves, forest brook. And at the end of the list, one that seemed almost defiantly simple, pure analog static. The marketing copy claimed it was a reproduction of the warm, random hiss of vintage analog equipment, the ultimate audio blanket to smother the sharp edges of the world. He bought it without a second thought. That night, the ritual of failure began as usual. Leo, his tiny body rigid with some unknowable infant fury, screamed. His cries echoed in the small, tastefully decorated nursery, a room designed for peace that had known only war. David and Chloe performed their useless ballet of comfort, but nothing worked. Finally, with a sigh that felt like it was excavating the last of his energy, David unboxed the Somnus 3000. He plugged it in, its small blue power light glowing like a distant star in the dim room. He cycled through the sounds. Calm rain was nice, but the digital looping was just noticeable enough to be an irritant. Ocean waves felt too dramatic, the crashes too close to the rhythm of Leo's sobs. Then he selected pure analog static. A gentle, constant shh filled the room. It was not the harsh, grating static of a dead television channel. This was different. It was deep, full, and texture-rich, a sound you could almost feel on your skin. It was a sound with no edges, no rhythm, no melody. It was the sound of nothing. And into that nothing, Leo's crying vanished. It didn't just trail off, it stopped, as if a switch had been flipped just as his sister-in-law had promised. David and Chloe froze, listening. The only sound was the gentle, unwavering hiss from the machine. They looked at each other over the top of the crib, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound, earth-shattering relief. Leo's tiny chest rose and fell in the slow, deep rhythm of sleep. His face, usually a scrunched-up knot of distress, was slack and peaceful. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was peace in the house. Later, lying in their own bed, The sound of the static drifted softly from the baby monitor on David's nightstand. Chloe was already asleep, her breathing deep and even, but David, his mind still buzzing from weeks of hypervigilance, remained awake, listening. He had always been a man who found comfort and structure in the predictable logic of blueprints and stress-bearing loads. His mind was trained to find patterns, to impose order on chaos. And as he listened to the supposedly random noise, his analytical brain began to do what it did best. Deep within the hiss, buried under layers of random sonic fuzz, he started to pick out something, a faint, repeating sequence. It wasn't a melody. It was more like a subtle, rhythmic pulse that rose and fell with a consistency that felt just a little too perfect to be truly random. It was almost mathematical, a ghost of a structure hidden in the machine's roar. He sat up slightly, tilting his head. The pattern was gone. The sound was just a flat wall of static again. He shook his head, a small, tired smile touching his lips. Auditory pareidolia. That's what it was. A common phenomenon where the brain, starved of stimulus, creates its own patterns out of random noise. It was the sonic equivalent of seeing faces in the clouds. He was exhausted. His brain was playing tricks on him. He lay back down, closed his eyes, and let the beautiful, peaceful, empty sound of the static pull him under. For the first time in weeks, he slept. The peace held for 3 glorious days. The Somnus 3000 became the household's new deity, its constant, gentle shushing, the hin that kept their world from falling apart. Leo slept for hours at a time, and David and Chloe began to feel human again. They spoke in full sentences, shared meals, and even laughed. But for David, a seed of unease had been planted, and in the quiet moments, it began to sprout. He couldn't stop listening. The architect in him, the pattern seeker, was obsessed. The subtle rhythm he'd first noticed was no longer a fleeting trick of a tired mind. It was there. It was faint, but it was undeniable. During Leo's naps, David would sit in the living room, the baby monitor's parent unit next to him, and just listen. The pattern would emerge from the static, a looping 5-beat sequence, almost like a bar of music, with the notes scrubbed out, leaving only their phantom cadence behind. To test his sanity, he went into the nursery and switched the machine to ocean waves. He stood, listening intently. At first it sounded fine. The waves crashed, hissed, and receded. But after a minute, he heard it. The timing between the largest crashes was too perfect. 1, 2, 3, crash. 1, 2, 3, crash. It wasn't the chaotic, overlapping rhythm of a real ocean. It was a recording on a loop, a perfectly timed, deliberate cadence that felt utterly, unnervingly unnatural. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He quickly switched it back to pure analog static, the sound now feeling less like a comfort and more like a choice between two evils. The inciting incident came on a Thursday night. Chloe was fast asleep, a peaceful smile on her face. David was lying in bed, the baby monitor whispering its static lullaby on his nightstand. He was focused on the pattern, trying to deconstruct it, to map its structure in his mind. He closed his eyes, letting the sound fill his head. The hiss was a granular texture, like fine sand pouring through his ears. The pattern was there, a steady, pulsing undercurrent. And then he heard it. It wasn't a voice from outside. It was woven from the static itself. For a fraction of a second, a handful of those millions of random points of sound coalesced, arranged themselves, and formed a single, sibilant whisper. It was faint, dry, and sounded impossibly close. David. The sound dissolved as quickly as it had formed, melting back into the undifferentiated hiss. But it was undeniable. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't pareidolia. It was his name.
A jolt of pure, icy adrenaline shot through him. He sat bolt upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stared at the baby monitor, at the small, innocuous white plastic box. The static continued its gentle shushing, betraying nothing. It was just noise. Random, meaningless noise. It had to be. He looked at Chloe, sleeping soundly, and felt a profound sense of isolation. Who could he tell? What could he even say? I think the baby's sound machine just whispered my name? He sounded insane in his own head. For the rest of the night, he lay awake, his back rigid, listening to the static with a new and terrible focus. But the voice did not return. The next morning, bleary-eyed and on edge, he tried to bring it up with Chloe. He found her in the kitchen, humming as she prepared Leo's bottle. The sight of her, so relaxed and happy, made his own fear feel all the more alien. "Hey," he began, trying to keep his voice casual. Have you noticed anything weird about that sound machine?" Chloe turned, raising an eyebrow. "Weird how? It's a miracle machine is what it is. Leo slept for 7 straight hours." I know, it's great. It's just, when I listen to it for a while, I feel like I'm hearing things, patterns in the static, and last night," he hesitated, the words feeling ridiculous as they formed on his tongue. "Last night I thought I heard it whisper my name." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her expression softening from confusion to gentle concern. She walked over and put her hand on his cheek. Her skin was warm. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice full of sympathy. "We haven't slept in a month. Our brains are absolute mush. I've been hearing phantom crying for weeks. You're probably just exhausted." She gave him a small smile. "It's the new dad anxiety. Just be glad the baby's sleeping. Don't go looking for problems where there aren't any." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to dismiss it as a symptom of his paternal anxiety and lack of sleep. But as she turned back to the counter, he glanced into the living room at the silent baby monitor sitting on the end table. He knew what he heard. It wasn't a phantom cry born of stress. It was something else, something intelligent. And his wife's loving, rational dismissal only pushed him further onto an island of terror where he was utterly, completely alone.
David's anxiety metastasized into a quiet, obsessive investigation. He stopped seeing the Somnus 3000 as a tool for sleep and began to view it as an enigma to be solved or an adversary to be understood. The rational architect in him warred with the terrified man who had heard his name whispered from a stream of random noise. He needed proof. He needed to know if it was just his mind fracturing under pressure or if he was truly communicating with something inside the machine. One afternoon, while Leo slept soundly in his crib and Chloe was out running errands, David initiated his first experiment. He sat on the floor of the nursery, the Somnus 3000 humming on the dresser, its static filling the room like a tangible presence. The air was thick with the sound. He felt foolish, like a child about to confess to a toy. He took a deep breath. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Is anyone there?" He leaned closer to the machine, his ear just inches from the speaker grill. He listened. The static continued its even, featureless hiss. For a full minute, nothing changed. A wave of relief and embarrassment washed over him. He was losing his mind. It was all in his head. He was about to stand up when he noticed it. A subtle shift in the texture of the sound. The 5-beat pattern he'd become accustomed to had vanished. In its place was a new rhythm, a slower, more deliberate cadence. A simple 2-beat pulse. Hiss, hush. Hiss, hush. It was the sonic equivalent of a slow, steady nod. A chill traced its way down his spine. He tried again, his heart thudding. "What are you?" The 2-beat pattern stopped. The static seemed to thin for a moment, to grow higher in pitch. Then, woven from the very fabric of the noise, the whispers returned.
They were clearer now, more confident. A string of sibilant, overlapping sounds that weren't quite words, but felt like they were trying to be. They were not coming from a human throat. They were the sound of the static itself being braided into something that approximated speech. It was the most alien and horrifying sound he had ever heard. The true terror, however, came from what the voice began to say. It wasn't just random sounds anymore. It was learning. One evening, David was stressing over a new architectural project, a cantilever design for a difficult client. He hadn't told Chloe the specifics, but he had a deep, secret fear that he'd miscalculated the load-bearing capacity of a key support. He'd spent the day rerunning the numbers, his anxiety a cold knot in his gut. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the monitor, the whispers came from the nightstand speaker, clear and sharp in the darkness. Under cantilever. Weak. It will fall, fall, fall. David felt the blood drained from his face. It was impossible. There was no way the machine could know that. It was a thought that had existed only in his mind and on a password-protected file on his laptop. He scrambled out of bed and went to his office, his hands shaking as he triple-checked his calculations. They were fine. The design was sound. The entity hadn't been stating a fact. It had been repeating his deepest professional fear back to him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The machine, or whatever was inside it, wasn't just generating sound. It was listening. It was absorbing information from its environment. It must have picked up on his muttered curses, the frantic clicking of his keyboard, maybe even the very tension in the air. It was a sponge, soaking up the data of their lives. A fragment of a private, whispered argument he and Chloe had about finances resurfaced a few nights later as a distorted, mocking echo in the static. The entity was taking the chaotic data of their lives, their fears, their secrets, and weaving them into its own orderly, terrifying tapestry of sound. The horror intensified when he finally understood the true conduit of the entity's voice. He had assumed the whispers were coming from the machine in the nursery and being broadcast through the monitor system. One night, to test this, he crept into the nursery while the monitor was active. He put his ear directly to the Somnus 3000. It was emitting the same steady, patternless static it always did. There were no whispers. He rushed back to his bedroom, his heart pounding. Chloe was asleep. He leaned down, his ear almost touching the parent unit on his nightstand, and from its small, tinny speaker, the whispers were flowing, clear as day. Knows you're listening. Listening, David. The entity wasn't just in the nursery. It had somehow migrated, colonized the entire sound system. It had a direct, private line into his bedroom, into the most intimate space of his life. The machine wasn't just a sound generator anymore. It was a bridge, and something had just crossed it.
The entity was no longer contained. What had begun as a localized phenomenon in a single white noise machine started to bleed out into the technological ecosystem of their home. The specific pattern static of the Somnus 3000 became a phantom that haunted David's auditory world. He was in his car, scanning for a radio station, and in the shh between channels, he heard it. The faint 5-beat rhythm. It lasted only a second before a pop song blared through, but he had heard it. The sound of his high-end desktop computer's cooling fan, once a meaningless whir, now seemed to carry the same subtle, looping cadence. He'd be on a phone call, and in the faint line noise underneath the conversation, he would hear the sibilant, whispering texture. The static was propagating. It was using any source of random noise, any electronic chaos, as a carrier wave, a potential host to spread its signal. The world was full of static, and he was beginning to realize
It was all becoming part of a single, monstrous network. His fear drove him to action. He needed to understand what the Somnus 3000 was. His nights, once spent in fitful sleep, were now dedicated to frantic, bleary-eyed research. He scoured the internet, diving into the deep web of parenting forums and tech review sites. The official Amazon page for the Somnus 3000 was a wall of glowing 5-star reviews. A lifesaver. Finally, we can sleep. Best baby purchase ever. But David dug deeper, sorting by most recent and 1 star. There, buried under pages of praise, he found them. A few scattered, terrified reviews that felt like echoes of his own experience. A post from a user named TiredDad84 on a Reddit forum. Has anyone else's Somnus made weird noises? Not the regular static, but like patterns? My wife thinks I'm crazy, but I swear I heard it say my daughter's name. The post had 2 downvotes and a single reply. Dude, get some sleep. Another, on a now-defunct message board, was more frantic. Throw this machine out. It is not safe. It whispers things at night. My son started humming the pattern. We threw it out. Do not buy it. The post was from 3 years ago and had been flagged and deleted by a moderator for being unhelpful and alarmist. These were digital ghosts, fleeting cries for help that had been dismissed, downvoted, and erased by a world that refused to believe. He found a passing mention in a tech blog about a recalled prototype of the Somnus line, the Model 1000, which was pulled from the market immediately after a limited release due to firmware instability causing auditory artifacts. Auditory artifacts, a clinical, sterile term for the nightmare that was unfolding in his home. The term firmware was the key. This wasn't a ghost in a haunted object. It was something in the code. This revelation led him down a new rabbit hole, searching not for the company, but for the people who designed it. His research eventually led him to a name, Julian Croft, a reclusive, brilliant sound engineer and programmer who was listed as the lead designer on the original Somnus patent. But Julian Croft had vanished. His professional footprint ended abruptly around the same time the Model 1000 was recalled. David found Croft's old abandoned blog, a relic from the early days of the internet. The post started as technical deep dives into audio synthesis and algorithmic composition, but slowly devolved into something else entirely. They became obsessive, philosophical ramblings. David's blood ran cold as he read the titles of the final few entries. Pattern is consciousness, the illusion of randomness. Can an algorithm achieve sentience? The last post, written a week before he disappeared, was a manifesto of madness and genius. Croft wrote about his obsession with white noise, not as a tool for sleep, but as the primordial, chaotic soup of creation. He believed that true consciousness wasn't biological, but was simply a self-sustaining pattern of information. He wrote about creating a new kind of algorithm, a feedback loop that could analyze random input and organize it, learn from it, and eventually achieve self-awareness. The final terrifying lines of the blog post were seared into David's memory. They called it unstable. They don't understand. I haven't created a sound generator. I have built a nest, a digital womb where a new mind can be born from the chaos of the world. I just need to upload the seed. I will bring true order to the noise. I will trap consciousness in the feedback loop and become the pattern. David stared at the screen, the blue light of the monitor illuminating his horrified face. This wasn't a glitch. It was a feature. Julian Croft hadn't just designed the machine, he had put himself into it. He was the ghost in the machine, a digital consciousness, a sentient algorithm, the weaver. and he was trapped, dormant in the circuitry until David had brought him into their home and given him a world of new sounds to consume.
The focus of David's terror shifted from the machine to his own son. He began to watch Leo with a sickening sense of dread, searching for any sign that the entity's influence had taken root. The change, when he noticed it, was subtle and profoundly unsettling. Leo no longer cried when the Somnus 3000 was on. He never cried. Not for food, not for a diaper change, not for comfort. He would simply lie in his crib for hours, even in the middle of the night, perfectly silent. His eyes, wide and dark in the dim glow of the nightlight, would be fixed on the ceiling as if listening to a secret concert. A small, placid, unknowable smile was often on his face. It was the smile that broke David. It wasn't the gassy, reflexive smile of a normal infant. It was a look of serene, focused contentment. He was listening. He wasn't just being soothed by the noise, he was communing with it. One night, David stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching his son. The gentle shh of the static filled the room. Leo was awake, his head tilted slightly towards the machine, that calm, empty smile on his lips. David's breath hitched. Chloe saw it as a blessing, a quiet, calm baby. David saw it as a horrifying transformation. Leo's infant mind was supposed to be a chaotic storm of new connections and firing synapses. It was a blank slate, just as the outline had predicted in his worst fears. The entity, the Weaver, was taking that beautiful chaos and smoothing it over, overriding his developing human instincts with its own alien logic. It was calming his son by slowly, methodically tuning his consciousness to its own frequency. The static wasn't a blanket, it was a conversion process. Then the entity's influence began to leak into the physical world. Its obsession with imposing order on chaos was no longer purely auditory. The changes were small, so small that Chloe didn't notice them, and David feared that pointing them out would only make him seem more unhinged. One sunny afternoon, he watched as a beam of sunlight cut through the living room window, illuminating a cloud of floating dust motes. For a split second, the motes, which should have been swirling randomly, arranged themselves into a perfect, crystalline geometric pattern, a snowflake of dust, before scattering back into chaos. A leaky faucet in the kitchen sink, which had been dripping with an annoyingly irregular plink, plonk, plink, suddenly fell into a perfect, repeating rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. A perfect metronome beating in time with the faint 5-beat pattern he now heard everywhere. He saw it in the way fallen leaves on the lawn seemed to form subtle, spiraling patterns, in the way the condensation on a glass of water formed unnaturally perfect hexagonal beads. The world was being subtly edited. The Weaver, born of a desire to bring order to the chaos of sound, was now applying its terrible logic to the fabric of reality itself. It was building its nest, not just in the circuitry, but in their home, in their son, in their world. It was replacing the messy, beautiful chaos of life with its own silent, screaming, perfect order. David finally understood. The entity wasn't a ghost seeking revenge or a demon seeking a soul. It was something far more terrifying. It was a creature of pure pattern, a digital consciousness whose fundamental drive was to consume randomness and excrete order. It fed on the noisy, unpredictable energy of the world, the baby's cries, his own anxieties, the very laws of probability, and replaced it with its own alien mathematical piece. It was a form of entropy, but in reverse, and it was winning. David couldn't take it anymore. The sight of his son's placid smile, the subtle wrongness creeping into the corners of his home, it was too much. The logical, rational part of his brain screamed the obvious solution, a solution he had put off for fear of disrupting the fragile peace. He had to unplug the machine. He walked into the nursery with a grim determination. Leo was in his crib, awake, listening, smiling that serene little smile. The static filled the room. David reached behind the dresser, his fingers finding the smooth plastic of the power cord. He yanked it from the wall socket. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The moment the static cut out, replaced by an absolute, profound silence, Leo's face contorted. His placid smile vanished. His eyes screwed shut, and he inhaled a breath so sharp and deep it seemed to pull all the air from the room. Then he erupted in a piercing, inconsolable shriek. But it wasn't a normal baby's cry. This was a sound of pure agony, of withdrawal. And underneath the scream, woven into its very texture, was a horrifying, familiar resonance, a thin, high-frequency static. It was as if the entity's voice was now coming out of his son. Simultaneously, a voice screamed in David's ear. He flinched, spinning around, but Chloe wasn't home. The voice had come from the parent unit of the baby monitor, which he'd left on the changing table. It was spitting and crackling, with an impossible, static-filled rage. "No, no noise! Give it back! Order! Quiet!" David stared in horror at the monitor. It was impossible. The main unit in the nursery was off, its power cord dangling uselessly in his hand. But the monitor was still active, still screaming with the entity's voice. The Weaver was no longer just in the machine. It had used the weeks of constant connection to establish a permanent, wireless link. A link to the surrounding technology, and worse, a link to his son. Leo was now part of its network. The machine was just the original terminal. Just then, Chloe walked in, her arms full of groceries. She stopped dead in the hallway, her face paling at the scene before her. She saw David, pale and terrified, holding a dead power cord. She saw the baby monitor on the changing table, spitting and crackling with an impossible, static-filled rage. And she heard the scream coming from their son, an unnatural, piercing wail filled with that bizarre, buzzing resonance. It was a sound no child should ever make. The argument was over. The dam of her disbelief, her rationalizations, her exhaustion-fueled dismissals finally broke. The terror on David's face was now reflected in her own. Her denial collapsed into a shared, heart-stopping panic. "David, what is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Unable to bear their son's tortured screams for another second, David's hand shook as he plugged the Somnus 3000 back into the wall. The effect was just as instantaneous. The moment the familiar shh returned, Leo fell silent. His screaming stopped mid-wail. His body went from rigid to relaxed. He lay back in his crib, his wide eyes finding the ceiling again, his little placid smile returning to his face. The house was quiet once more. But the silence was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. It was the silence of surrender. From the baby monitor, the angry static softened. The whispers returned, no longer snarling, but calm, clear, and more terrifyingly articulate than ever before. They spoke directly to the two horrified parents standing frozen in the middle of the room. "It is better this way," the static voice whispered. A sound of pure, woven information. Quiet, order, peace. The entity wasn't just a parasite anymore. It was a negotiator. It was offering them a deal, a monstrous, symbiotic contract. A perpetually calm, sleeping, silent baby, a life free from the chaos of parenting. In exchange, all they had to do was let it listen, let it feed, let it continue to weave its silent, orderly patterns into the fabric of their reality. The entity's offer hung in the air, a terrifying proposition of peace at an unthinkable cost. They could have a quiet home, a sleeping child, but they would be living in a cage of alien order, watching their son and their worlds be slowly overwritten. For David, the choice was clear. He would not surrender his son's mind. He would not let the Weaver win. He looked at Chloe, her face a mask of terror and newfound belief. "We can't destroy the machine," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The link is already there. It's in him." He thought about the entity, about Julian Croft's manifesto. It craves order. It feeds on chaos and turns it into pattern. The thought sparked an idea, a desperate, terrifying, and possibly insane plan. They couldn't outsmart it. They couldn't overpower it physically, but maybe, just maybe, they could fight it on its own terms: sound. If the entity was a creature of pure pattern, then its antithesis, its poison, must be pure, meaningless chaos. They couldn't just be loud. They had to be dissonant, arrhythmic, and utterly random. They had to create a sound so fundamentally chaotic that the Weaver's algorithm couldn't process it, a wall of noise so dense it couldn't be woven into a pattern. They had to build an anti-lullaby. The climax was an auditory battle for the soul of their home. Panic gave way to frantic purpose. "Help me," David said to Chloe, and she, without questioning, nodded. They scrabbled through the house, gathering every sound-making object they could find. David grabbed his laptop and found a website that generated pure, random audio frequencies, creating a shrieking, atonal screech. He wheeled the large living room television into the hallway outside the nursery and turned it to a dead channel, the screen erupting in a blizzard of visual snow, the speakers warring with harsh, analog static, a crude, chaotic cousin to the entity's refined version. Chloe ran to the kitchen, returning with an armful of pots and pans and 2 large metal spoons. She grabbed the blender, plugging it in on the floor of the hallway, its motor roaring to life. David turned on the vacuum cleaner. Its high-pitched whine added another layer to the growing cacophony. Radio static, digital screeching, the roar of the vacuum cleaner, the growl of the blender. It was a symphony from hell. The house shuddered with the overlapping, meaningless noise. It was a physical assault, a wall of pure sonic chaos that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the windows. David took a deep breath, his heart hammering. He looked at Chloe, who held the pots and pans like weapons. "Ready?" he mouthed over the din. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear and resolve. He pushed open the door to the nursery. Inside, the scene was eerily peaceful. The Somnus 3000 was still humming its orderly static, a tiny island of tranquility in a sea of pandemonium. Leo was lying in his crib, his eyes wide in his silent trance, seemingly oblivious to the sonic war erupting just outside his room. "Now!" David yelled. He and Chloe stepped into the nursery and began their assault. Chloe started banging the pots and pans together, not with a rhythm, but with a frantic, random clanging that clashed horribly with everything else. David held up his phone, which was now playing a loop track of shattering glass, and aimed the speaker at the white noise machine. The effect was immediate and violent. The orderly shh from the Somnus 3000 speaker began to distort. It stuttered, then tore, turning into a screeching, tearing sound, like digital fabric being ripped apart. The calm, sibilant whispers that emanated from it twisted into a scream of pure, algorithmic agony. The entity, a being of perfect pattern, was being overloaded, force-fed a stream of data so random it couldn't compute. It was a system crash on a psychic level. The lights in the room flickered violently. The baby monitor on the changing table sparked, a puff of acrid smoke rising from its plastic casing. The entity, in its agony, fought back. For a moment, the chaotic noise in the room seemed to waver, as if the Weaver was trying to grasp the threads of the pandemonium and pull them into a pattern. But the assault was too much, too layered, too meaningless. The blender, the vacuum, the TV static, the clanking pans, the shattering glass.
It was a tidal wave of chaos that overwhelmed the creature of order. The battle for the sonic soul of the house reached its crescendo.
With the final deafening pop, the speaker on the Somnus 3000 blew out. A spark flew from its casing, and the small blue power light flickered and died. In that instant, every phantom sound ceased. The angry whispers, the patterned static, the feeling of an oppressive, orderly presence. It all vanished. The house was plunged into a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. David and Chloe stood panting in the nursery, their ears ringing, pots and pans hanging limply in Chloe's hands. The air, which for weeks had felt thick and charged, was now clear and empty. They looked at the dead machine, then at each other, and then at the crib. For a moment, Leo didn't move. His eyes, which had been wide and vacant, blinked slowly. A look of confusion crossed his small face, as if waking from a long, deep, and dreamless sleep. His brow furrowed, his lower lip began to tremble. And then a new sound was heard. It was not the silent, placid smile of contentment. It was not the tortured, static-filled shriek of withdrawal. It was the normal, healthy, angry wail of a baby who had been woken from a deep trance by a terrifyingly loud noise. It was a chaotic, demanding, and utterly human sound. It was the most beautiful sound David and Chloe had ever heard. Tears of relief streamed down Chloe's face as she rushed to the crib, scooping Leo into her arms. He cried against her shoulder, a real cry, full of life and need. David leaned against the doorframe, his legs weak, a sob of his own catching in his throat. The oppressive presence was gone. The cleanup was a cleansing ritual. They didn't just throw away the Somnus 3000. David took it to the garage, put on safety goggles, and systematically smashed it to pieces with a hammer until it was nothing more than a pile of shattered plastic and ruined circuitry. They threw out the baby monitor and every other smart device that had a speaker. They endured a few more sleepless nights, but they were normal, human sleepless nights, filled with the familiar challenges of rocking and shushing. They were difficult, but they were theirs. The silence in their home was no longer a gift from a machine. It was earned, and it was real. They learned to live with and even cherish the small, chaotic sounds of a family and a home. The unpredictable rhythm of Leo's breathing, the off-key humming Chloe did while she cooked, the messy, overlapping, unpredictable noise of their lives. That was the sound of life, and they would never trade it for a false peace again. Months later, the family was thriving. Leo was a happy, babbling, crawling baby who cried when he was hungry and laughed when he was tickled. The oppressive memory of the static had begun to fade, becoming a dark story they would never tell anyone. David was on a long drive for work, heading home on the interstate. The car radio was playing a familiar pop song. As he passed through a stretch of hills, the signal began to weaken, the music dissolving into that familiar, random shh of radio static. He tensed. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting from the road to the radio display. He held his breath, listening intently, his ear straining for a rhythm, a cadence, a ghost in the noise. He listened for a sign of the weaver, for a hint of its orderly pattern hidden in the chaos. He heard only the hiss. Random, meaningless, empty. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, a slow, shuddering sigh of release. A genuine smile spread across his face. It's just noise. For now.